Hello and welcome to the Dark Side. I am your host, Tabitha Purple, and my co-host is Mr. Storm. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right.
We've already been arguing before the show starts, so let's get into it. We are happy that you are here with us. Please do feel free to comment. Join in at any point. We enjoy the challenge of answering some of your questions and having you involved in the show. So today I've got a few news stories that I'm just going to go through quickly. Why not ask what you're up to in the background there, Mr. Storm? All right, so I'm going to give you two news stories that I think are quite well linked together. The first news story is out of China. There have been protests across the major cities in China, including in Beijing and Shanghai. This is to do with the COVID-19 restrictions that are still going on over there. I think it's quite interesting that the rest of the world maybe is experiencing this kind of laissez-faire attitude to COVID-19 because of the high uptake of vaccines. We've been able to enjoy that. But actually, China has a relatively low uptake in vaccines. And so in order to protect their elderly, they're actually continuing with rolling lockdowns. And this is obviously affecting people's lives. And so this has been going for 3 years. They are having a lot of protest. With that in mind, the second story linked to this is that there is the possibility that there will be a universal flu vaccine that could counter a future pandemic. I find this one very interesting. So it looks promising. So some scientists have gotten together and they've made a breakthrough designing a vaccine against all 20 known types of flu that currently exist. It uses the same messenger mRNA technology that the COVID-19 vaccine used. And I've got to be honest, the story is two sides of a coin that I find quite interesting. One side of the coin is that a country that actually we don't know as much about as we think we do. They are a communist country. They have different rules, regulations, regimes. They have different protocols, language barriers, etc. And so what we know is a very carefully curated information about is still struggling to get the COVID-19 under control. They're still not having as much vaccination uptake. And so therefore the West is enjoying this kind of lull because they did really push the vaccine. And for every anti-vaxxer who protested that, whatever. But that is the whole result of that, is that we've had a pretty open society, whereas the opposite side of that coin is over there. But what I find really interesting is, isn't it interesting what capitalism prevents the world from doing? So capitalism, the idea of like the market forces will force innovation and technological advances and so on and so forth. What we actually see particularly is that when that button is pulled off, when capitalism's primary function is pulled off, and the function is to actually work together to resolve a problem that we're all experiencing because we might die, then all of a sudden, innovation, new technology, everything gets, we can do anything. And you find that people can put money behind whatever. And all of this new technology that's been put in towards vaccines has now made huge strides in the world. So the idea that capitalism, particularly, is what gives the world its edge, is what makes us competitive, is what creates a market in which we're creative and we're trying to push the envelope, has been proved false, if you ask me, through this one simple thing, is that we have the COVID-19 vaccine, which was pushed heavily, and therefore, because it was pushed heavily, because everyone worked together, because it was coming together, and some would argue stealing of ideas from other people, but anyway, that's a different issue. Because capitalism and profit were put to one side while it was being created, was put back on the table after creation, but while it was being created, you got this real creative, innovative energy that was able to do something that otherwise seemed impossible without the funding of all of these things. And so now it looks like that because of that one thing, we now may have other solutions to problems. And we've talked about this with HIV, we've talked about this with other types of vaccines that they're trialing, that actually could solve problems that the world has been living with for a very long time, but because it wasn't profitable to invest in those things, now we're only getting them. So that's my kind of 2 COVID related stories that I think really bring out a point that the dark side dwells on quite a bit. Okay, I'm gonna let you eat your chips and go on to my next set of stories. The next set of stories actually come out of Russia and the Ukraine. One side of the coin is that the amount of genocide that they believe is being generated within Ukraine is horrific. And so there are some investigations being done. It looks like there's approximately 11,000 Ukrainian children who've been forcibly deported to Russia. There's something like 39,000 cases of war crimes, or those sorts of things that they're investigating. And there are about 14 there are people in about 14 regions and the capital that are under kind of restrictions because of the war there. And so this is really affecting people. The other side of that coin is talking about how the Russians have been targeting Ukraine with their power grid, and how now that we're coming into winter, what they've been doing is trying to take out their power grid, which has left about 50% of the population, or 6 million people, without electricity, depending on which source you look at. So the president says about 6 million people. The energy company says say about 50% of the population. 50% of the demand from the population cannot be met anymore because of that. And my question that I have when I look at this story, when we see these two sides of a coin of the kind of annihilation and destruction that you're doing in the country, is what good comes of this? So you're doing all of this. The people will never want to be part of you because you've come in and you've bombed them to within an inch of their life. You've abused them. You've dispossessed their houses. You've dispossessed their land. You've told them everything about their life is wrong, insignificant. You've bombed them to within an inch of life. They're grieving over the lives lost. People have had to flee. You're creating an environment in which terrorism, being the modern word that we use, but people being vengeful for those crimes would then come up. And for what reason? Like, why? Just leave the people alone. You're creating all that destruction to, in the end, to make yourself feel better because you believe they would be better off with you. I mean, you're creating a whole future long-lasting animosity and mess that has potential repercussions for generations. Forget the rest of Europe, forget the rest of the world, but between these two nations, you are creating generational mess that will long outlive those who are now in the conflict. Why would you do that? And then also, aren't we, and now comes another bit which is probably not quite as related and people might think, when we read the biblical narrative, sometimes we have a really, oh my gosh, look at those savage people. Hello. We're not much better. 21st century. We're still doing the same thing. And so I find it quite interesting that we have these ideas that you get this kind of, oh, look at those people in the Bible. How could they? How dare they? How, they're wiping people out for no good reason. Look in your own backyard, love. We're still doing that in the 21st century. The problems spoken then still exist today, that this kind of thirst for power still exists. And so do we not wrestle with the text in a different way without the kind of, oh my gosh, look at those people who are uneducated and ignorant? So those are kind of my two questions, I guess. And then my final story is actually about a museum in London. And so this particular museum, which I don't actually know the name of for some reason, but anyway, this particular museum in London is closing one of its exhibitions. It's called the Welcome Collection, and the Welcome with 2 L's. And it's closing its Medicine Man display. And what has happened basically is it's a very controversial display that's happening. It's about medical history that's been running, and it depicts different paintings, different works which are historical to the time and how people were actually investigating and treating. So one of those things that it includes is there's a controversial object of a painting from 1916 titled "A Medical Missionary Attending to a Sick African." And it basically depicts an African person kneeling in front of a white missionary. And people have obviously looked at the context of that and said, okay, that's inappropriate, and we know how some of those illnesses came to the people. We also know that there's a white savior complex behind, so on and so forth. So they've been trying to work out this museum. How are they going to deal with this? Because it's looking at history, it's looking at a particular period, but the things that are in it are racist, sexist, ableist. I mean, the list is endless of the kind of ists that it goes through, and it is just constantly problematic. So what they've decided to do in the end is just to withdraw it because they cannot figure it out. But it led me to think about, in the end, when we look back on history and at those periods of time, the reason that the display is racist is because it is from that period of time when it was a racist, sexist, ableist society. So how do we depict things from the past, not, of course, wanting to cause offense in the present, but acknowledging this is where we have come from. These are the problems that we have. And what place does a museum play in that? And yes, they have kind of fought with how they've displayed it, but in the end, do we have to really wrestle with the history of the UK, the history of England, the history of the colonizing countries, a bit more with a bit more integrity, to say, these pictures exist. The reason they exist is not so that they can be locked up and, gathering money for someone else, but actually because it depicts a time in history in which this is an idea that we believed in and now we don't. And how can you put that into an educational context, particularly within museums, in which schools tend to go to museums quite frequently, etc. So it got me to thinking a little bit about those things. So those are my 3 news stories before we get to main story. I don't know if you have any thoughts or that you want to share your news stories today, Mr. Storm.
Thoughts. Let's see. On the last story that you mentioned, I think part of the problem that we're having with the UK, and it's not just the UK, I think part of the problem the US has too, is that there is a national responsibility and a national guilt that goes with the history that they have never apologized for.
Mm. Mm.
And they've never owned up to, and they've never accepted.
Mm.
And because they've never done that, you've been unable to have the honest conversation surrounding it.
Mm.
So how do I display something from history, from a racist time in my history, and give it its proper due weight and context, if as a nation I haven't given what has historically been done its due weight and context? And so they can't afford to have these things on display, and they can't afford to have the conversations,
Mm.
and not having the national conversation makes it hard for institutions within the country to have those conversations,
Mm.
especially within a British context where the institutions were started historically by the aristocracy,
Mm. Mm. Mm.
right? So you're talking now about the ruling class
Mm.
having, direct interest in these things,
Mm.
and then having to take and accept responsibility for themselves.
Mm.
Um, so those are my thoughts on that. In regards to news stories, listen, there's been some funny stuff that has happened this week. The Suella Braverman incident is hilarious.
Okay, for those of us that have not watched the proceedings that were happening over at Westminster, fill us in. What happened?
Right. So I believe it was a Home Affairs Select Committee,
Mm.
and that is a cross-party committee that is meant to give some oversight and accountability to the Home Secretary and the Home Office. It
Mm.
had Suella Braverman, and I don't often do this, but I have to give credit to a Tory for holding
Miss Braverman.
Miss Braverman to account.
Hmm.
And these are the people who come from the same political party. And he did a really good job of grilling her
Mm,
on the fact that there were no safe and legal routes for
mm,
people from certain areas of the world to apply for asylum within the UK.
mhm,
And when she tried to wriggle out of it, he would not let it go
mm.
until she ended up looking a right idiot. So, and it wasn't just him. It was others. I mean, if you watch the longer videos of what was happening, she was humiliated. And at one point, she's she's sitting in the middle of these two guys that are with her, and she looks at them and says, "Have you got anything to say? Have you got?" She's looking to them for help because there's nowhere to go.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
think the most commonly used words that I've been able to find in regards to, or that I heard being used in that questioning session by Suella Braverman was, "I don't know." Everything was, "I don't know, I don't know," and this is somebody that is in a position of power, and you know absolutely nothing about what is going on. So, yeah. What else has been happening this week? Uh, I actually don't remember off the top of my head now. Yeah. But anyway, that one was.
The Suella Braverman one for me is quite interesting because I think a couple of things strike me. This is the first time that that question is really being held to account. This is
Hmm,
not the first time that this issue has occurred, however. This is an ongoing problem with the UK because this has been started way back in whoever's administration, that Calais was begging the UK to set up safe routes for people to apply for citizenship so they could process people out of Calais, either to the UK or to the Europe or back to their own country. And this was something that Calais had been begging for, and we've covered this before in the story. But again, other Home Secretaries have been able to wiggle out of this question. Suella Braverman is the first one who's actually had to face the question head on and has had to deal with it. That being said, she is still new to the post. She would be forgiven for not knowing everything. The fact that she was in that committee and wasn't able to even articulate, well, it's only been a few weeks, gentlemen. You know, give me a moment. Nothing
hmm,
is quite sad, though, I think. And yeah, I mean, I'm glad that someone's being held to account. It's just a shame that the party isn't acknowledging that this is, or the government is not acknowledging that, as you would say, this is a deliberate, consistent action in which you are all complicit and guilty, because this has been going on for decades. You have no safe routes to apply as an asylum seeker if you arrive in Europe.
I don't think Suella Braverman gets a free ride or the ability to say I've only been in the post for a few weeks because she was a lawyer before that
Mm,
defending the Home Office.
mm,
So she would have already had a lot of insights into the
yeah,
workings of the Home Office.
yeah.
So it's not like somebody who wasn't involved with it came into the post and then said, "Well, hey, I'm trying to get up to speed." You already have a lot of knowledge on this.
Mm, mm,
Um, and there were a lot of basic questions that were asked within this interview, like how many judicial reviews are currently being undertaken in regards to Manston? Those three words, I don't know. You know, I don't know.
yeah, she didn't
I
know
don't
much about anything, did she?
know.
What did she think she was going in there for? I mean, I must admit, she was very unprepared.
As
I
I
mean,
said,
she
the
really just
people
was not
I
prepared.
know that know her say
Sharpest
she
tool in
ain't,
the brain. She's
no.
not the sharpest crayon in the box. Excellent. Well, as I said, I think it's interesting that now it's coming home to bear, and she may well be the fall guy for it. But I think that would be letting the government off lightly, because this is a systemic issue that has been systematically done. Like, this has been going on for decades, in which Europe and Britain have had this tenuous relationship, particularly France, Calais, with the port there, having this relationship with the UK, saying, look, we need you to set up better routes for people to apply, so that we can process people, so we can stop having camps here, so that we can stop kind of, you know, the illegal trade, the illegal trafficking of people. And it would, you know, it's good that it may finally be dealt with. It's just sad that you'll have one fall guy, and the systemic or issue that crosses parties, crosses the whole of British societies, may fly under the radar in the face of pulling, you know, the one scapegoat, you know. And she's a really, as you say, she's well done, but yeah, there's a bigger issue at play, which is y'all didn't do this before. You've not done it before. You know, when Theresa May was Home Secretary, were you grilling her like this? No? Any of these other people, were you grilling them? I mean, even Priti Patel got away with some of this stuff. I mean, you know, come on. What is this nonsense?
Listen, a lot of them have gone away with murder. Another story just came to mind, actually, which is another funny one. I don't know if you've seen the Mick Lynch and Daily Mail reporter interaction.
No, I
Right.
haven't.
So the RMT has, that reminds me of another story, actually. But the RMT have called 4 48-hour strikes.
Okay, yep.
Okay.
48-hour strikes. Okay.
2 just before Christmas,
Mhm.
and 2 just after New Year's.
Okay.
So the Daily Mail reporter says to Mick Lynch, how does it feel to be the Grinch of Christmas? So Mick Lynch responds, I would expect that characterization from your establishment. And then he goes on to say, what was it? He goes on to reference what the Daily Mail called Mosley and the Black Shirts. And they called them, what was it? Can't remember the exact phrasing, but the Daily Mail basically said the black shirts were like intelligent people, real patriots.
Okay. Who are the
Right.
black shirts?
Right. So the black shirts were a fascist group within the UK in the 19, I think 60s is a bit late, maybe 40s.
That old chestnut.
But, and then Lord, I can't remember which one it was, who was actually the owner of the Daily Mail historically, was praising Hitler, and Mick Lynch brought that up, you know, and
he was ready for them. That's basically what happened. He was ready for them, and he
he's like, I got the receipts for this. So basically, how your characterizations of people is not to be trusted. We've seen historically, you know, the people that you've praised, you know. So when you're trying to demonize somebody, maybe a more accurate assessment of that person is going to be the complete opposite.
Indeed. Well, I think what's interesting is, I don't know about you, but I have fond memories of tube strikes. I'm a Londoner, I'm proud to say. And I remember during every Christmas, every New Year's, there's always a tube strike. There's always a rail strike. Somebody's always going on strike. This happened over decades, particularly under Thatcher years, particularly under in fact, all different prime ministers. We've always had rail strikes. I find it quite interesting that maybe because we've had a couple of years, or maybe the UK has enjoyed a period of peace, I don't know, where there hasn't been as many rail strikes. I don't know. But I find it quite interesting that people are acting like this is the end of the world. Like, they don't know that rail workers deserve better and safer environments to work in and that people don't strike for those things. It's as if every time this happens, it's brand new information. Like, oh my
Well,
goodness, they're on strike.
I,
There
well, I
can't be a
think
reason for this.
I think what it is that in recent years they've made it harder to go on strike than it is for you to leave an international treaty.
Touche. Here we go.
Right?
Come on now.
I think that's perhaps why there haven't been as many strikes. You know,
Indeed.
it's easier to vote a new government for a new government than it is to vote for a strike,
Yeah.
right? So I don't think that there's really been a period of peace within the UK. I think it's just been difficult to get the actions that you want out. And since we're speaking on strikes, I think it's important to note that the Royal College of Nursing is going on its first strike ever.
Yes, indeed. Indeed.
In
That would
106
be,
years, they're going on their first strike.
they should have gone on the strike many, many years over, I think, the way that nurses have been treated.
And I think we need to. This is my prediction, right?
Okay.
This is my prediction. You see all these same outlets that were saying, "Hey, clap for the nurses. Our NHS is important," etc., etc., etc.
Mhm, mhm.
They will be the same ones that are going to be demonizing the nurses in a couple of weeks for going on strike. They're going to be calling them scroungers.
I
They're
really
going to
hope
be
not.
saying that they want something that they're not deserving of or
I really
entitled
hope
to,
not. I really hope not.
right? And you're going to see this whole 180 on nurses, and you'll see a real demonization of them. And I
I
think
really
it's
hope
important to bear in mind that in 106 years, they've never been on strike. So when the demonization comes about they're lazy and they want something they're not entitled to, I think it's important that people bear in mind 106 years, and this is your first strike. What would bring you to the point
not. Mm,
where you deem it necessary to do it for the first time?
mm,
And the other thing is that it wasn't until the 1990s that the Royal College of Nursing actually believed in strikes
mm,
and industrial action.
mm.
So this is a fairly recent shift in their position, but even after that shift, they still never called a strike. So yeah. Anyway, that's I thought was an interesting point, and I think that's my prediction for what is going to happen. And you're going to see a complete mischaracterization and demonization, slandering of health professionals in the UK, because I believe it's not just the Royal College of Nursing.
No, no, they're talking about, I think every major industry across the UK has some form of strike coming. So you've got nursing, transport, telecommunications, Royal Mail. I mean, it looked
The
like
lawyers are just coming off strike.
lawyer, yeah. So like every industry looks like they have some version of strike action. If they collided in one setting, which some will actually collide, I think, it could grind the country to a complete and utter standstill. I mean, most of you will be standing on the street side by side. It'll be interesting for me. What is interesting is that people have the ability, and maybe this speaks to our main story a little bit that we're going to get into, which is you can see it with your eyes, you can hear it with your ears, but somehow when a media outlet puts a shiny cover on it, you don't believe what you see or what you hear. And I think that that's really quite worrying. So people know that nurses are underpaid, underfunded, disrespected. They have terrible working conditions. The hours are extreme and long, that they are care professionals. So they do this not for the pay, but they do it for the heart of the work. They believe in the work that they do, so on and so forth. And yet still, you will be angry with them for, as you say, breaking that for the first time in 106 or 60 years. I couldn't quite tell, to strike. And I think for me, there is something really kind of interesting that's happening within society where we are really, you introduced me to this idea of pathological individualism, where we can be so narrow-minded and focused on our own self that we don't think about the impact that things are having on other people. When we're talking about nurses not getting paid properly, this puts a tremendous amount of pressure and stress on those nurses financially, in their homes, in their lives, with their children, with everything. And they're coming into work, which is a stressful environment already, with stress on them. And then you're expecting them to perform at high academic, intellectual, caring, functional level and never make a mistake. That's a ticking time bomb. That's a recipe for disaster. You're talking about people who are under incredible mental strain. Some of us, can't even go to work and have a bad day without it causing, the whole thunder and lightning. Can you imagine what that's like for a nurse to be under that amount of financial, physical pressure, then to come into an environment in which they're under constant pressure to be absolutely precise and exact, and then you're not thinking that a disaster is happening. These are nurses are fighting for their lives right now, if you ask me, because that's your mental well-being right there. And we've seen that during the corona period. And maybe I speak passionately about this because I have friends who are nurses in the NHS who love what they do, young people who love what they do, who absolutely adore the work that they do, are passionate about the work that they do, but have been traumatized. While you guys have been clapping, they've been being traumatized. They're not being remunerated for it. They're not have time. People are leaving in droves. There is no investment in them or in their time. And so they have no time to grieve. They have no time to process. They have no time to get their well-being under control. And I think it's quite shocking that you can know that. You can hear that when you're clapping for them on the street. You know that they're suffering. When you stood there clapping, going, our nurses are doing an amazing job. Our doctors, amazing job. You know that. You hear it, you see it, you've been at the hospital, looked at them, how many hours are they working, 12-hour shifts, you know the problems, and then you go, yeah, but they shouldn't strike though, should they? Because it's inconvenient to me. It's quite worrying. And then you vilify them, like you listen to the vilification of a media outlet and you go, yeah, they're right, that's about right. Please don't do that.
No, it hasn't happened yet, but that's my prediction. It's coming.
I do hope not. I mean, we've seen it in other industries, but I really do hope not.
Well, really it has to. It has to, because you have to remember that the press in the UK is very much right-leaning. And if they don't demonize care workers, doctors, nurses, care home staff, etc., then the only option is to give them their pay rise. Because it's going to be it's going to be such a big issue that you can't stay silent on it. You either have to come out in support of it, or against it. And the problem is, if you come out in support of it, you're going to have a pretty hard time telling the train drivers and rail staff and all of that, no, we're not giving you a raise, and all the other industries, because I'm just waiting for the garbage collectors, the refuse.
There've been those strikes. There have been those strikes. Remember, there were towns and cities that were covered in trash because they went on strike.
Yeah.
I mean, you also have the teachers are going on strike, head teachers. I mean, you're talking about all of the kind of critical workers in the UK striking after a period in which they've been the most under pressure and the most, kind of celebrated, if you will. So it's kind of interesting to see how will that affect. You've just been celebrating these people for 3 years, talking about how they've given their lives to this cause. More nurses died during the pandemic than any other demographic. Of course, statistically, you are more likely to die. So there's all of these sorts of issues that arise that you've been championing, that you've been reading about, that you've been lauding up. But now it comes time to say that the same people who are human, who have been under pressure, who have been going to hell and back with this whole stuff. And now that the financial crisis has come into a head and you're doing two things at once, which is a different issue altogether, but you're doing these kinds of moves, you're putting those same people under the most intense pressure. You're going to have to pay them. You're going to have to pay them. That's just the reality. You're going to have to pay them. And telling people it's unrealistic to expect inflation-related price hikes, well, something's got to give. Either the prices have to decrease or the wages have to increase. And that's the only thing we're getting. And that's the reality. There's no shift. I would love to say that the prices will all decrease tomorrow, because Jesus knows we all need a break. But yeah, you know.
I think, yeah, and before we move on, I just think it's interesting that people will say politicians deserve the wages that they get because they have to make decisions for the country. Nurses make decisions for the country on an individual basis every single day. Doctors make these decisions for the country on an individual basis every single day. And when it comes down to it, if I have to go for a surgery, I would rather know that the person who is about to do it is well paid and not under any mental stress.
Right? Can eat well, has their lights on at home, the gas bill's paid.
I'm like, listen, nurses are going to food banks, right?
Yeah.
So that means you're under mental stress.
Yeah.
Perhaps you're not eating in order that your children can eat. Which means your blood sugars will be low. You're not going to be thinking straight. All it takes is one slight mistake with my medication, and that's me done.
Bob's your Uncle, Betty's your aunt. We're finished.
Right? My children, hey, they're just gonna be like, well, daddy was here. Thank you for his life insurance. You know, but that's
life
the reality.
It's the reality, yeah. It's life and death situations. This is what doctors and nurses particularly hold in their hand. Yeah.
And yet we somehow think that they don't deserve to be well paid.
No.
And I just failed to understand that, where you would say, hey, so all the military advisors, the higher levels who deal with these things, are better paid. Why? Because they have to deal with matters of life and death.
Yeah.
Well, so do nurses and doctors and care staff every day, and they deserve to be paid for it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you've mentioned military, which will bring us on to our big story, so to speak, of the day. The big story of the day being that the Royal Navy in the UK are going to be changing the way that they handle complaints of rape and sexual assault within the Navy. But on the back of that change, Admiral Sir Ben Key recently told the BBC's Radio 4 broadcasting house that the Navy had to change how it investigated the complaints, but that it had, if it went to an external force investigating it, that the investigations, if it went to an independent investigator, they would be slower. There would be less good outcomes for people, and therefore this was not the way to do it. But we do need to overhaul, just not like that. The Navy has launched an inquiry following allegations made last month of bullying and sexual harassment against women in the submarine service. And there has been a famous case, if you want to look up the case of Catherine, in quotation marks. She's basically told Woman's Hour, which is a BBC program, that she had been raped and had gotten pregnant as a result of the rape while serving at sea. She told the program that the rape was the most serious thing that happened to her, but that there were a number of separate complaints that were going on, lower level things that were happening, and that there were also many other women who were going through similar things. And there are other reports that you can read that talk about the levels of sexual harassment claims and complaints that are against Navy officers. And what they say is that this is a drop in the ocean, because the Catherine, in the quotation marks, said she never reported it. And the reason she never reported it is because it's always done in-house, and it affects your literal safety on the ship. And so, of course, there is this idea that the chain of command issues come into play. But as I was reading this story, one of the things that really struck me is that the story's focus was on the Admiral Sabenki's idea that if you had independent investigation, if you employed someone that was independent to investigate the crimes that are happening at sea, he says that he wouldn't like people who do not understand the pressures and working environment of being on a boat, because they would not understand the complexity of the situation and therefore will not handle the complaints in the way that they should. Oh, what? I read that line. I was like, this man must be mad off his head. I'm sorry, what? Like, what? Yes, you're right. It is a unique situation. You are a floating, living environment in which thousands of people live on a ship for, months at a time and do not come back to shore, do not see family members, etc. But the complexity of that is so difficult for an outsider to understand that they would not be able to handle a complaint of sexual misconduct or a rape appropriately to the situation. What would be appropriately to that situation? What is it that you're trying to indicate to us? And remember that this was focused on women, but there are numerous men who have these sorts of complaints in the works, and this is an ongoing issue for the Navy. But I say this on the back of the fact, the reason I wanted to look at it is we have talked about sexual assault in various organizations. We've talked about it within the Catholic Church. We've talked about it within gymnastics. We've talked about it in the police services. We have talked about it with Ravi Zacharias. We've talked about it on, religious, political, every kind of front that you can think of. People will very quickly pick out stories of religious situations and say, see, it's just this problem or that problem. But sexual assault permeates throughout the whole of society. There is a deviant sort of human who does this type of behavior that impacts other people. When it's done within a power institution, it leaves us with questions of how does that institution handle this? What strikes me is that this Admiral Sabenki is suggesting that independent investigation is not necessary, is not the way forward, when we know from all the other cases in every other institution that if it's done internally, we can look at the SBC that we did recently. If you do it internally, if you do these investigations internally, that they come up with cover-ups, with it's not that bad, with vilifying the victim, with bullying, with all of these other sorts. But yet still, this man believes that that's not the case for the Navy. It beggars belief, and it does make me ask the question, how do we have accountability in these large institutions where there will sadly, deviants want power. They will go into situations to try and take advantage. How do you have an accountability? What is a system that works? And then how do we as a society look and listen and hear people's stories without jumping to the easy answer? It's so much more complex than the easy, simple answers, I think. Anyway, that's my intro for the kind of main story today, looking at the Royal Navy in the UK and their new, or at least the investigation that's going into how they can look at handling complaints of sexual assault and rape.
Okay. Right. And so I know I'm going to get blowback from the "it's not all men" brigade. But I have to question your characterization of the people that do these things as deviant.
Oh, okay.
And that is because if the society protects it, the society tacitly endorses it. And as such, can such behavior be considered deviant?
Oh, gosh. Is that... Where are our viewers when I need them? Help me, people, help me. Oh, that's okay. That's a complex. Do you want me to answer this? This is not a question. This is
You
just something
can
for
if
us
you
to
want.
ruminate. This is something for us to ruminate on. You continue. You continue. I don't need to answer that question. You continue with your points.
Um,
Lord.
I think there are a couple of things to consider also within this, in that the question of whether they are deviant behaviors or not.
Yeah. What is it?
Or if they are actually intended by the system. And I ask these questions based on a couple of factors. And the first one is racism, and how racism within the armed forces in the UK has been investigated. And the fact that it is very similar to the way in which these allegations of sexual assault and sexual abuse are being pursued and investigated. With both demographics, people of color and women are not supposed to be there. It historically, armed forces and armed conflict wasn't considered the place of women, and people of color historically, well, depends how far back you go, but for the past couple of hundred years, have been told that they don't belong within the UK, and as such within British Armed Forces. So the reluctance to investigate racism, I see connected to the reluctance to investigate allegations of sexual abuse. These are methods used to control these people who are not supposed to be there, and to make them more reluctant to apply and join these institutions because they're not supposed to be there. So I don't see this as um, a flaw in the system. I see this as part of the system. The fact that they're not investigating it is intentional. And we go back to the historic aspects of where Black people um, were not supposed to belong. And historically, they did not investigate that.
No.
And the reason was because they didn't belong. It's easier for us to get rid of these people. It's easier for us to discourage these people from even joining up if they know we're just not going to entertain their complaints.
And
And
the
so,
same is true for homosexuals.
yes,
You know, that's very much the same is true for anyone who would display a homosexual behavior or tendency, or however you want to say it. You know, if you're found to be in the army, you will be on the receiving end of some of the most awful treatment. You know, it goes to many issues, not just, you know, the sexism, as you say, but it does look at race. It does touch on, you know, homosexuality or queerism, you know, and so on and so forth.
the point I'm making is that the failure to investigate and take these complaints seriously
Yeah, really
is
impacts every
something
single
done for every group
yeah,
who they believe does not belong. So it
absolutely.
doesn't matter what group you belong to. If
Mhm,
they believe you don't belong there, they're not going to take your complaint seriously.
mhm, mhm. I mean, then what does that say to us as a wider society? You know, how do we actually come to a place where we are investigating and handling these complaints? We've seen it across so many different institutions now. This is you know, the Navy is one in a long list of different institutions from different backgrounds. You know, the Navy is armed forces, you know, it's military, etc. But we've seen it within politics, we've seen it within policing, we've seen it within education, gymnastics, churches. I mean, it's almost touches every institution within the world. So how do we handle that? You know, and you know, Admiral Sir Ben Key is saying, not with external,
Right.
investigators. So, well, then what exactly are you suggesting?
Right. So I think, well, you're asking two questions. I think the first question of why do we see it in pretty much every institution and all these different facets of the world is because there is no one facet. There's no one area institution in the world that truly accepts the idea that everybody belongs and intrinsically has value. And
Mm,
yes, it's a very harsh condemnation of the Christian church and whatever religious organization you want to belong to,
mm,
but it's also a criticism of secular ones
mm,
because they all have built within them ideas of who belongs and who doesn't.
mm, mm,
And because of that, you place value on those that you feel do belong,
mm,
and
mm,
you
mm, mm.
place less value on those who you feel don't belong,
Right, right, right. Understood.
right? And the second question was in regards to the British Navy and this general's response. Look, the reason the general's responding in this way is because he knows that they are going to actively stonewall the investigation,
Mm,
right? You actively did it when it was in-house,
yeah.
so you know you're going to do it when it's external.
Mm,
And you know it's actually going to be easier for you to do it when it's an external person doing it or external body doing it, because you can then just say, oh, this is classified. Oh, this is sensitive. This is this is that. And you just give people to run around.
I mean,
So
but then shouldn't the person have to have the kind of authority and power to say, doesn't matter, don't care, we're going to look at the papers? Or in fact, if you have a count against you, then guess what? We're just going to remove you for the safeguarding of everyone. Done. Quite simple. Sorry
right,
for the odd one that slips through that maybe might be smoke without fire, but the reality is that's a very small percentage, since it's normally 0.4% that are false claims. So for the 99.6%, we'll just get rid of them. If you have a complaint, then you're being removed. Punt. Is that not just an easier method of dealing with it? If you're really concerned with the safeguarding of people.
yeah, look, but this comes back to the idea of institutions and the fact that institutions will serve to protect themselves first and foremost.
Right.
Right? I mean, everybody knows what the answer is. You name a problem in the world, and people know what the problem is, what the answer is. Hey,
Mm-hmm.
so for example, take the UK.
Mm-hmm.
No, we'll take the Netherlands, for example. There's a housing shortage.
Mm-hmm.
What's the solution? Stop people hoarding houses.
Mm-hmm.
Build more houses.
Mm-hmm.
Ain't nobody doing that, though.
Well, interestingly, there are injunctions against the local councils that seek to do that. So there are local councils, gemeentes, within the Netherlands who seek to actually stop hoarding in their cities.
Mhm.
They will refuse to sell to outside organizations, etc. And they're being taken to court to stop the behavior because that is anti-capitalist, whatever
But
the law is. Do you
but
see what I mean? So it's like, even if you try, you got all this foolishness that
but
goes
that
on.
just proves my point about, look, ain't
Load of
nobody doing
solutions.
anything about this because you could actually change the law to do it,
Yeah.
right? So people know what the answers are.
Yeah.
There's just no real will from those that benefit from it to do it. And within the institution, like the Royal Navy or the armed forces, there's no real will to do it, because all it does is it brings harm upon the institution, or allegedly it will bring harm upon the institution. It will bring greater oversight, and it makes it harder for you to function in the ways that you have that have historically benefited you.
Mm.
Right. So yeah, I think people know that an external investigation is the correct way to go, but you're not actually going to give an external investigation, in most cases, the authority or the power to actually do their job. And even if they did do their job and they did it properly, you're going to do your best to cover it up. So, for example, where they talk about racism and complaints of racism within the armed forces in the UK, and historically people have complained, the approach to it was to have a private chat and to do their best to water down any charges that were made. And of the complaints that moved forward, I think it was something like only 17% were recommended for like a court martial or something like that. Um, which means that the people that were investigating this, it was the military police,
Mm.
but I've forgotten who else was investigating it. But one of the people involved in the investigation said, look, the actual true number of people suffering from racist abuse is going to be much higher.
Mm.
And
Mm.
I've had a lot of people come in and say, look, I'm having this issue, I'm having that problem, but I stay silent because I know it can affect my career.
Mm.
And I think perhaps that's one of the other things that needs to happen, and why an external body would be good is because it can provide a level of anonymity,
Mm.
right? And in providing that level of anonymity, you can actually do that for both the accuser and the accused,
Right, right.
right? So neither party has to be made.
Public.
So what you would do is you would establish within the armed forces a unit that would deal with and provide the information to the external investigators, and it will be a sealed, airtight unit, right? Which means you protect both the accuser and the accused until the external investigation is completed, right?
Mhm.
And I think that will be the best way to move forward and to ensure this, because then those that make the accusations,
Mm.
and whether they're true or not, their careers don't need to be negatively impacted unless the external investigator says, actually, we have evidence to suggest this was actually a maliciously motivated accusation,
Mm.
right? But also those that are cleared don't necessarily have their careers hampered
Mm.
by an accusation hanging over them.
Yeah.
And I think actually, if you look at it, it's the fairest and best method to move forward for all parties involved.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so yeah.
Yeah, I think it's important as we consider our ideas, and if I bring it back to kind of the religious sector for myself, reflecting on some of the stories that we've covered over the years that we've been doing the dark side, and the ones that I'm looking at in the future. So listening to, say, Christianity Today, they've just released their big investigation into sexual abuse allegations within Christianity Today as an organization, as a journalistic organization. And they made some interesting decisions right off. So having investigated a number of other institutions, they're a news outlet, so they were investigating Ravi Zacharias, they were investigating Mark Driscoll, they're investigating Hillsong, they're doing these investigations into other people's bad practices. When their own came to their own attention, so it didn't come out in the public, it came to themselves first, they had a decision to make as to how they were going to behave. And what they chose to do was have an independent investigation. That was their first thing out of the gate. And they chose to publish the findings without seeing them. So regardless of what they said, they were being published straight to the public, straight to the news site, without oversight from the managing director's team, etc. And I found that quite interesting, because I thought, isn't it interesting that a news outlet, which has been responsible for investigating and holding others to account, when faced with that challenge, decided that they needed to make a different decision than others had made. And it goes back to something we said way back. We were talking about the SBC, I think it was, and it was off the back of talking about the Catholic Church, and it talked about all these other different churches that had this. And we said at the time, you know, I really do think that every institution just needs to go, you know what, let's just clean house. We may or may not have anything. There may or may not be something that we know about, but let's just invite independent investigation inside to deal with this. And in the case of Christianity Today, they really took that approach because the people that were involved were all retired and left, etc. But they just said, you know what, let's just clean house. Let's just deal with this. Let's just, because for the victims of those abuses, it's important that they have a safe space. It was important that they have the right to speak freely, to be trusted. But they also noted this, that an independent investigation and the results of are only the beginning of the story. But that process is so exhausting that you need almost a different team to come in and deal with what happens next. And that part of the story intrigued me because I've always thought only about what happens in holding the people accountable. But of course, there's the aftermath. There's the changing your policies and procedures to make it more difficult to have those kinds of people in your ranks, to make it safer for the people that work there in the future. There is obviously all those people that will have been involved in the case that will need help and counseling to deal with and process all of their angst, stress, you know, etc. And so I think it doesn't just stop with the investigations. It doesn't just stop with an external investigator. There has to be a process that takes it one step further. It's probably what I'm now landing on, which is that you need an external investigator, but then you also need almost an external implementer, someone that comes in and holds your organization to account to changing those rules. Because as you and I have spoken about many times on this show, many organizations, many, we've talked about councils that have fallen foul of this, police that have fallen foul of this, where they will have report after report after report after report. And what do? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So, you know, you need kind of both sides of the coin. You need somebody who's going to investigate and allow that safe space and do those things that you've talked about. But you also need someone to come in, then take over and say, okay, now that we have the report, now what we're going to do? How are we going to change our policies and procedures? How are we going to implement better things?
Yeah, I guess you have to give kudos to Christianity Today for their approach. Although I'm dying to see the one or the day that they do one into racism within the organization, because their comment section is a cesspool of racism. And you have to wonder, what is it about the culture and ethos of the organization that allows such a group to feel safe within your spaces online? That would be my first question. So there's got to be something also within the ethos of the organization that fosters this. But perhaps in the process and the journey that they're on regarding the sexual allegations, they'll clear house and clean house on this too. And I think what separates Christianity Today from the other organizations that we have mentioned is that they actually had a real desire to change, right? There was a commitment to saying, hey, look, we're going to do this. And then, listen, the chips fall where they fall. What you have with other organizations that do carry out reports is we'll do a report and then we're going to edit it, censor it, and then we'll release it. Right? But by just saying, look, it's going straight to the public first, it leaves you nowhere to hide. It leaves you with no room to try damage limitations. And the only reason you take an approach to that is if you're actually committed to change.
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So in their position and how they've done this, yes, I can understand why they would bring in an external party. But I also believe that where you're committed to change, bringing in an external party is the best option,
Mhm.
but it doesn't necessarily preclude you from being able to make those changes within the organization.
No,
It
no.
really depends on how committed are you to changing. And I think an external party is a good option, especially where you recognize that there's going to be a resistance and reluctance to change. So we don't know what the conversations were like at a departmental and managerial level. At a board level, we don't know what the conversations were like. We don't know if the split and the vote to go ahead with this was so tight, because as you say, there's going to be allegiances to old guard, there's new guard, there's all of these other things
Mm,
that actually calling in an external body to then implement these changes is perhaps the safest way to do it,
mm,
and takes a lot of the politics out of it.
mm,
So I can understand why they would look to implement such an approach. But
mm,
if at board level they were all committed to making the change,
mhm, mhm,
it would make it easier to do it within house, having read the report, because I'm pretty sure the report will say this is wrong, that's wrong,
mm.
and as I said earlier, people know what's wrong, and you know how to fix it.
Yeah,
You know what the solution is.
yeah, yeah. I mean, well, I also think somebody spoke about something when it came to big institutions, and then we want we want the big simple solution. And I think there are big simple solutions. Of course, you let go the person who is causing a problem. Yes, but that doesn't stop the actual problem. The problem will arise again if you continue to foster those sorts of environments. And so there are lots of little things that need to change, lots of very painful conversations that need to happen, lots of restorative moments of listening, which aren't as easy to put into practice as they sound, right? It's like, can you stand to hear the voice of the victim crying? Can you do that? Can you listen without going buts or if and only, and trying to explain their pain away, so to speak? I think it really does call on us as human beings, and I would say particularly as Christians who are held to a biblical standard, but call on us as human beings, full stop, to actually look at the harm that's being caused by not holding institutions accountable for the problems that are happening on the inside, and allowing them to just get away with we brushing things under the carpet, ignoring the issues. If you're working for an institution, which we all do, it is important for us to as much look at our own institution and say, okay, how can we make this a safe environment? What can we do to allow people who come into our spaces to feel safe, to not only feel safe, but to be safe? Feel safe all you want, but if you are not safe, then there is a real problem. And so I think those are just those are questions that are really, it's important for us to think about how we actually help in these situations. Yeah. Well, I think, unless there's anything else you want to add, Mr. Storm.
Listen, I'm sure there's plenty I can add on this, but um, I don't know how much you like your job, so
Well, I'll jump a little bit. So we're gonna end there. We're gonna
yeah,
say thank you so much for joining us this evening. We know some of you watched them back. Thank you so much for those that got in touch for watching back last week. We know that we're entering into the busy period of the year with all of the holidays amalgamating now. So Hanukkah and um Diwali and Thanksgiving and Christmas, and everything kind of gets busy
Cyber
around this.
Monday.
Cyber Monday, whatever your particular holiday version is. So we're really grateful for those that managed to squeeze us in and find the time to watch us back or watch us live. We're really thankful to you. We only have a couple of more weeks and then we break for the Christmas holiday as well, which is important to say that we will also go on Christmas break. So we will only do a couple of more weeks of this and then we are off on Christmas vacation. So if you have a topic that you would like us to cover, then please do let us know. But watch this space because I believe next week we are doing the dark side of nations. Since Mr. Storm, you really want to cover that topic and people are quite excited to hear what you have to say. This is going to be fun. So you already have your topic. Enjoy. Every week I get asked the same question. What are we doing? So this week we're letting you know what we're going to do next week. We're really grateful that you join us. Thank you so much for being with us here on the dark side. Have a blessed week. Peace out.
Yeah.
Right, bye, people.